afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. My name is Josh Harrison. I'm the president of a software development firm called Improving. I'm also a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and I am pleased you are all with us today. Let's take a moment to thank today's sponsors, The Ohio State University and Event Marketing Strategies. We would also like to thank Grange Insurance Audubon Center and its amazing staff for their ongoing supports, and Jan Allen for her help in making today's forum a reality. Thank you as well to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream, which is carried on CMC's social media platforms. Let's thank all of those supporting us today. To borrow from the title of his new book, today's featured speaker truly has been in the heart of it all. Dick Celeste, a native of Lakewood, Ohio, served as governor of Ohio from 1983 to 1991. We are honored to be joined at CMC today by an Ohio governor for the first time since 2019. Please welcome Jeff Milgram from our sponsor, Event Marketing Strategies, to introduce today's speaker. Jeff, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Josh. It's my pleasure to be here today, and so much fun to see so many familiar faces around the room from the 80s and from the governor's administration. Some of you I haven't seen in probably 30 or 40 years, so it's a real kick. When I initially received the email announcing today's event, I was very excited to learn that Governor Celeste was going to be here in Columbus, so I immediately picked up the phone. I called Laney and Jane at the CMC and said we'd like to sponsor today's forum. In 1984, during the governor's first term in office, our agency began managing the corporate sponsorship program at the Ohio State Fair. Working for the state and General Manager Jack Faust, who I'm sure some of you may remember from back then. So when I think of working with Governor Celeste in the 1980s, this is how I remember him. The governor's the one on the left. So you know. Okay. Believe it or not, we're still working for the Ohio State Fair 39 years later. We were also fortunate enough to have the opportunity to have worked with the governor's office during this time, helping to promote one of the best ever all-time state tourism marketing campaigns in the whole country, Ohio, the heart of it all. So as you can see, Governor Celeste and his team played a very important role in the early years of our agency, and I'm honored to be here today to introduce him. But before I do that, I'd like to also acknowledge two other great Ohio public servants who are with us today. First, longtime Franklin County Commissioner and a friend of the CMC, and I'm happy to call her my friend, former Commissioner Paula Brooks. Paula, if you could just stand up and say hi. Next, I'm happy to welcome our current United States Congresswoman from Ohio's 3rd Congressional District and immediate past chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Joyce Beatty. Joyce? Now, on to today's speakers, whom you can read more about in your forum flyers. But if you haven't taken the opportunity to read it, I'm going to summarize. From Lakewood, Ohio, by way of Yale and Oxford universities, through the Ohio House of Representatives and the Lieutenant Governor's Office, to Director of the Peace Corps, two-term Ohio Governor, U.S. Ambassador to India, and President of Colorado College, please welcome Governor Dick Celeste. It's also my pleasure to welcome our host today from Washington Courthouse to the Ohio State and Spalding Universities, through WOSU Media and Ohio Wesleyan University, reporter and producer with the Ohio State News Bureau, Joe Ingles. Joe, we look forward to today's conversation, so take it away.
Great. Thank you for having me. It is a true honor to be here to talk with Governor Celeste. This is a great opportunity. I'm not going to belabor anything because I know we want to get right to it. So I want to ask you, Governor, you've been a governor, a diplomat, a university administrator. You served in the Peace Corps. You've probably done more than that, but I'm just getting the highlights here. You've had some personal challenges, and you go to that in your book, such as losing the race for governor and personal and marital problems. That's a lot of life experience. So what have you learned from it all?
You know, my grandmother used to say, it's a mighty long road that has no turn. And I kept that in mind often, both in my political life and in my personal life. And it's interesting because I don't think people would normally think that this is the case. But the truth of the matter is, if you read the book, you'll understand when I say this. I was more honest in my public life than I was in my personal life. And I say that partly as a matter to acknowledge reality, but also because I want to encourage young people. We have a few of them here in the audience. Not as many as I'd like, but anyhow. I want to encourage young people to believe that public service is a terrific way to devote your life and the experiences you have in the public arena and the opportunity to make a difference is extraordinary. And I think today, unfortunately, too many people have a sour view of public service. So what have I learned? I've learned to celebrate the privilege I've had to serve. I've learned that, as my oldest son said to me at one point in my life, Dad, you never knew how to hold a job. I mean, I was ending the 8th year as president of Colorado College when Eric called me. Dad, I'm calling to warn you. Warn me about what? Oh, he said, Dad, you're sailing into uncharted waters. I said, what do you mean, uncharted waters? He said, Dad, you've never held a job for more than 8 years in your life. Anyway.
Well, as governor, when you were in office, you increased funding for education, for health services and veterans programs, welfare programs. But in doing that, you increased the state income tax by up to 90%, depending on how you figure that. Now Republicans in the Statehouse are trying to decrease income taxes and would like to get as close to zero as possible. In your opinion, is that possible, and what's the cost of doing that?
Well, there are some in the room who are old enough to remember the fight to get the income tax. That was in 1970. Jack Gilligan was governor. The Republican House and the Republican Senate, and the Republicans were in a majority in both houses. So you had a Democratic governor who was insisting that we create an income tax in Ohio. And twice he vetoed budgets, and it wasn't until December of 1971 that we adopted an income tax bill that was basically written as a compromise between a Democratic governor and Lloyd George Kearns, the chair of the House Finance Committee from Marion, Ohio, for any of you whose memories go back that far. And I mean, it was an extraordinary achievement because it was a bipartisan bill. I believe that I talk about this in the book. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't have the communications advice that I should have had, Jeff, from really thoughtful public relations people and the rest. I wanted to be bold. I said, we're not going to do business as usual. And we needed, when I became governor, Governor Rhodes had gifted me a deficit of $400 million, which had to be made up by June 30th. And so we wrestled with that, and we decided we had to maintain the temporary increase in the tax that he'd imposed and add to that. I made a terrible mistake in how I communicated that tax increase. And I made a second mistake by not saying that should we have revenue in excess of what we thought, that we would reduce the tax over time. Some of that tax reduction, I think, has made sense. But I think the idea of reducing to a flat tax or eliminating the income tax is incredibly unfair. It puts a burden on people who are paying sales tax. It puts a person on fixed incomes. It is an extraordinarily regressive perspective. So I think it's ill-considered. I think it will come back to haunt future governors as they try to deal with the challenges of growth and change and investment in public infrastructure in the state.
Right now, there's a lot of discussion at the Statehouse about the possibility of putting a statewide ballot issue out there that would make it harder to pass constitutional amendments in the future. Back in 1983, it was Republicans who went to the ballot to try to get voters to repeal the income tax increase at that time and approve another measure that would have required a 3/5 majority vote for future tax increases, and both of those failed, by the way. What do you think about the idea of requiring 60% voter approval for constitutional amendments?
I think it means you don't trust people. I mean, the irony is you want to put an issue on the ballot to increase the number of votes necessary to pass to 60%, and you want to pass it with 50%. So here's my suggestion. If you believe that 60% is a good idea, require in the language of the amendment that this amendment shall be passed by 60%. And then you get a fair test of it, right? I mean, I am stunned, frankly, by the number of people who are frightened by voters, who want to do things to repress the vote one way or another. Why do you want to have one drop box per county? I mean, I live in Colorado. I've got a drop box a mile and a half from my house. I can walk to the drop box to vote. And I voted in an election yesterday. I was here, but I voted because they sent out the votes, the ballots early. I voted 2 weeks ago. I mean, come on. If we, this is one of the things that frustrates me. And the interesting thing is, again, young people are more confident about going out and organizing and making a case on an issue than most politicians are today. And I think I'm frankly disappointed. I have to confess, I used to be an admirer of Frank LaRose. I now am not. I'm a critic of his because I think what he's done in the last year and a half has been a big step backward from the direction that he had taken earlier.
It's well known that you stay in touch time to time with former governors Taft and Strickland and Kasich. Can you share some insight and maybe an anecdote or two about what you talk about when you get together, or is that really a private thing?
Oh, we lie to each other a lot. No, it's interesting because, again, I would take, well, Bob Taft and I have always had a cordial relationship. We worked together on the board of Battelle for Kids recently. I have a great admiration for him. And I think there was an exemplary Secretary of State when he was Secretary of State as well as service as governor. John Kasich and I are interesting. Some of you may remember his parents died very tragically in a car accident. Drunk driver hit them as they were coming out of a restaurant. And it was right before the Christmas holidays. And when the State Patrol told me this, I called John and I said, listen, I don't want you to spend the Christmas holidays alone. He and I had a relationship because he'd grown up in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, not far from Menneson, PA, where my dad grew up. And so I said, come on and stay with us for the holiday weekend. And, I don't want you to be alone. And so he did, and ever since we've been good friends, even when we disagreed politically. I mean, when he put the issue on the repeal of the state collective bargaining act on the ballot, I thought that was not a good idea. I thought I opposed it, and he lost. And I told him I won again, John. Except I wasn't winning, and people of Ohio were winning. I mean, and so we get together. I think he shares some of my frustration with the way politics has been practiced in recent years, and probably his frustration with his party is even greater than my frustration with my party from time to time.
Do you have any advice for Governor DeWine?
Second term is always harder than the first term because, you know, people are starting to organize for how they're going to run for the job. I think his legislature is going to have challenges, both, you know, I mean, he had challenges before with his legislature, and sometimes, you know, it was, I was standing, my family came in to the governor's office as I was about to be inaugurated as governor. Jim Rhodes was there to meet me, and we were going to walk out to the Statehouse platform where the inauguration was going to take place. And he said, Governor, look around. See these people? Pointing to my family. They're the only ones you can count on. He said, the teachers really supported you, didn't they? And I said, yes. He said, look out for him. He said, you're going to have far more trouble with your friends than you'll ever have with your enemies. And it was an interesting comment because I think, you know, Denny Watnowski was dealing with the legislature after we took office, and then we had, at that point, we controlled the Senate and the House. And so we as Democrats thought we could do anything we wanted to, or anything they wanted to, not necessarily what I wanted to, but, you know, it was our friends who posed the challenge. So I think, you know, Kasich and I will get together and we'll talk about his friends and my friends, and, you know, our whose friends are giving us a harder time, right, ever.
Yeah, that's going to be a long conversation, I bet.
Longer for him than me. My friends are pretty good.
Well, you are the last two-term Democratic governor in Ohio, and one of 3 Democrats elected to governor since 1958. That's a lot when you think about it. What are the Democrats in Ohio maybe doing wrong? What should they change to try to win more gubernatorial elections or elections in general?
Well, I think, you know, everybody says this is a red state. Red and blue are not really very descriptive of politics today, if you really want to know the inside story. If you were to look at the official records of the Secretary of State of Ohio, you would see there are more registered Democrats than Republicans in the state of Ohio today. It's like 937,000 to 820,000. There are 6.2 million unaffiliated voters. That's true across the country. The biggest political party in this country are people who will not choose a political party. They're going to vote for themselves. And so any successful candidate has to think about, how do I reach not just my partisans, but how do I reach the folks who want to vote but are not identifying with a party? And I think that's the challenge for Democrats, and that means getting into 88 counties. That means spending time in Washington County or Vinton County, all across the state of Ohio, and talking to people about why Democrats should be chosen to lead this state. And I think if young people do that, you look at you watch the issue of choice when it goes on the ballot in Ohio. It will show a dramatic division in this state that is an opportunity for people who believe that women should have a right to choose about their reproductive choices. And I think the same thing would be true if we put an assault ban on the ballot in the state of Ohio. People would turn out to support an assault ban in the state of Ohio. I think that political parties are uncomfortable with those. Well, at least one political party is uncomfortable with those issues. But people want us to be dealing with these hard issues, and if the political system, and this is tragically, I mean, Joyce is stuck in a really tough situation right now in Washington, where it is really difficult to deal with the fundamental issues. Everybody wants to deal with the cultural issues, you know? I'm sorry. I have one biracial grandchild. I have a gay grandchild. My grandchildren represent a spectrum across this, across our society, as most of our families do these days, right? You look at the changes that are going on among young people. Let's get back to the real things that count. And I think that if the Democratic Party, and I've said this to Liz, if the Democratic Party organizes county by county, sits and listens to people, go to the public library, the League of Women Voters, or wherever it is, and have a conversation with people about what is really counting today, and are you prepared to get involved? You're going to see a tremendous number of people get involved on this choice issue when it goes on the ballot.
Public trust in government is at an all-time low. Election denialism is at an all-time high. Politically based threats of violence have become commonplace. What is the recipe for breaking this fever and putting us on a path back to civility, rationality, and the common good?
Well, I don't think, I wish there were an easy answer. I think that there are at least two institutional problems that have exacerbated, let's say, the differences. One is gerrymandering. I mean, gerrymandering is a disease, and it's not easy for me to say this, but in a way, Congresswoman Beatty should have a more competitive congressional district, and every congressional district in the state of Ohio should be competitive. That's not the way it's been drawn. And that is wrong, and that's true in the state legislature, and that's true across the country. The more gerrymandered a place is, the more you invite extremes to be candidates. And so my hope is that when the former Supreme Court Chief Justice and others put an issue on the ballot to create a real fair districting issue on the ballot in Ohio, it will pass. It will help to ease some of the incivility. I think dark money is terrible. It is also a disease. It invites people to push money into races and not have my name on it. So, number one, every political contribution should have a name associated with it. If you're prepared, if you want to do something politically and you think it's free speech, use your mouth and put your mouth on it. Don't hide it. That's not free speech. That's not free speech. And I think that we have to find some way to tackle the issue first of dark money and then of the size of contributions, although I have to say, it's ironic for me to say that because when I ran for governor, you may remember this, Cheryl, when Bill was running too, you could accept any size contribution you wanted. So I was running for governor in 1982, and I needed to raise money, and I would go to the first contributors and say, listen, I'm going to win this race. I need to raise $6 million. The first $1 million, I need 10 guys to do $100,000 each. And people did $100,000 apiece. And it was reported with their name on it, Peter B. Lewis, Milton Wolfe, Albert Ratner, whoever they were, their names were on it, right? Now you've got people pouring millions of dollars into races and never putting their name on it. So I think if you're asking me how do we change this, I think part of it is also cultural. I think that the role of the media and social media is corrosive in this regard as well. It's easy to be angry or nasty or whatever when you're on screens or when you're just putting something on a Facebook post or whatever. It's harder to be, when you're in conversation like this. I can't really be nasty to you, Joe. I mean, I'm gonna, and you're gonna be nice to me too. But I think if we could have fair congressional districts And if we force people to associate their name with any political contribution they make, that those two steps would be serious steps in the right direction.
Yeah. We have a brain drain in Ohio, and I know you know that, and you work with college students. You're around that young adult age. When you had your cabinet, you had a whole lot of young people working for you in important positions, actually, and you engaged young people. What needs to be done now to make sure that young people who graduate from college see themselves living and staying in Ohio?
I think to me, it's a matter of economic activity and encouraging innovation and making it easy to start businesses. Columbus, if you look at the Columbus metropolitan region, it competes favorably with the top 20 metropolitan regions in the country. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton, they need to be doing the same kinds of things to attract young people and to keep young people, and I think those communities are working at it. It's fun for me to go back. I mean, I just yesterday met one of my daughters for breakfast at Grumpy's Cafe in Tremont. And for any of you who know Cleveland, you drive to Tremont today, and if you'd driven there 20 years ago, the difference is dramatic. And who's buying those townhouses? Who's moving into those apartments? They're young people who are coming into town because they can afford it, and there are opportunities for them. So I think that we're going to see more of that. The truth of the matter is that these days, the question is, do I need a college degree to do what I want to do? And there are more and more young people saying, I can get a skill, and I can use this skill, and that skill is highly portable. So people are going to, when you have a portable skill, and when you don't have to spend 5 days a week in an office, but often can do it remotely. I mean, last night I had a conversation with two young people who were thinking of moving back to Columbus from California, I think. But what's interesting is they both work remotely, so they could be anywhere. My youngest son, 7 kids. My youngest son is 25, designs video games. He sits in Irvine, California. He could sit in Dublin, Ireland. He could sit in New Delhi, India. He could be anywhere for his job and be doing it. And that's part of the challenge.
Wow. So let me ask you this. What does Ohio have going for it? What's the best thing Ohio has going for it?
It's the heart of it all.
I opened it up, didn't I?
Look. I don't know whether it was Mark Twain or a famous novelist from Mansfield, Ohio, who said Ohio is the furthest west of the east, the furthest east of the west, the furthest north of the south, and the furthest south of the north. And John Glenn used to, when he was campaigning, he'd say, if you took the United States and squeezed it, and squeezed it, and squeezed it, and squeezed it, you'd end up with Ohio. And you think about that, we're still within 500 miles of 60% or more of the population of this country. We have an incredible richness of academic institutions. We have the most important resource 20 years from now or 30 years from now, the best access to fresh water anywhere on the face of the planet. Now, you look at the dividing line between the Great Lakes watershed and the Ohio River watershed. That's Ohio, and we have it. And the rest of the world is going to be begging for it over time. And I believe that if I were back in the governor's office, I'd be trying to create a center on water assurance and other things like that at universities around this state to help promote our access to water, because I think there are all sorts of things, and we didn't used to have venture capitalists in Ohio, but we now have people who have money and who are really interested as venture capitalists and investing in startups. They'll make, some of them will succeed, some of them will fail, but that's the dynamism that you want, and the more we can do that, the more Ohio will thrive.
We see parts of Ohio, the Columbus region, growing, getting new jobs, new businesses, Intel, and all that comes with it here in central Ohio. We see all this growth in these urban areas, but if you go out in the more rural areas, you don't see as much growth. You were talking about going to all the different counties and talking about the issues that are important to them. So what do you see as the prescription to make sure that all of Ohio prospers and not just Columbus?
Well, one of the interesting lessons, I think, it was a tough period, but during the pandemic, it was interesting how many young people, because everybody was working remotely, moved to rural communities, or moved out of urban areas. It was a better place to raise their kids, or they could have more property, whatever it was. I loved small town Ohio. I think that I was lieutenant governor. I was living in Delaware County, not too far from where you live, Joe, and I think there are a lot of people who would like that. Part of it's to get away from what seems to be the crunch of urban living and the rest, right? So, just one story. I was visiting a county chairman in 1982 at a coffee house in the county seat, very small county, which I shall not name. And after we had coffee, he said, "You got to come over and meet my secretary because she knows every Democrat in the county, and she's really the person you want to meet." So as we started over, he stopped, and he said, "Do you mind if I do an errand?" I said, "No." He opened the door of his car, the buzzer went off, picked a camera off the front seat of his car, this is a long time ago, unrolled the film, and walked into the drugstore to get the film processed. Came back out, threw the camera on the seat of the car, closed the door. I said, "You leave the key in the car and your camera on the front seat?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Don't you worry about your car getting stolen." He said, "Dick, there's only one person in this community who steals cars, and we know who he is." So I thought that was pretty interesting. 2 months later, I'm sitting in the governor's office. I get a call from him. He said, "Governor?" He said, "I'm just calling you to tell you." Oh, the rest of the story is we were going to the office. There was a Rolls Royce sitting there. I said, "Who's got the Rolls?" He said, "Well, he's a class action attorney, and he got a big black lung settlement." I said, "Does he leave the keys in his car?" He said, "Oh, yeah." So I get a call 2 months later. "Governor," I said, "Hey, how are you?" He said, "I'm good." "Hey, I'm just calling to tell you that the Rolls got stolen yesterday." And I said, "No kidding." I said, "Did they find it?" He said, "Yeah, it was in the driveway of the car. That's a guy that always steals cars." Now, come on, who wouldn't want to live in that community, right? Tell me, over and over again, there are places where you go where any store you go into, any place you go for a meal, all of the kids who are at the soccer game with your kids or whatever it is, you know all of them, right? And that is a value that is deep. It is not marketed well, but now more and more that can be marketed. What you don't want to do is to ban books and force public libraries to have problems, because in those small towns, the public library is a cultural center, is where the activity is, right? And so I just think, it takes selling, it takes marketing, it takes, promotion to say, look, there's a reason to be in Vinton County. And it's not necessarily coal or anything like that. You can make it fun. You can go to the junior fair there, and they have a frog jumping competition, right? Wow. I actually bid on the number 2 frog at the Vinton County Junior Fair, and they knew I was bidding. The winner had gone for $4. When they found out that the candidate for governor was bidding, I got the frog for $18.
You overpaid for that frog. Well, we'll move to questions from...
I did overpay, but the county chairman realized that somebody knew who I was, and so he sent me out of the tent, and he was the one, and got the bidding stopped at 18. Otherwise, it would have been a lot more.
Okay. Well, we'll move to questions from our live stream and in-person audiences in just a few minutes. If you do have a question, make your way over to the microphone now. And if you're watching online, please type your questions into the chat. Before we take the audience questions, though, I have one more question for you. I'm going to ask you to pretend you're in Las Vegas and you're an odds maker. And this is a national question. What are the odds that President Biden will run again? What do the odds say this far out about his most likely opponent? And what does that presidential campaign look like?
I think the odds are about 90 to 10. What is that? 9 to 1. That Joe Biden will run again. I think that the odds are 60-40 that an indicted former president will be his opponent. And I think that election would be bizarre in many ways. It would be something that we haven't seen in this country, even in the last 2 elections.
Yeah, bizarre would be one
Let me just say, by the way, as somebody who's 85 going on 86, I wear a mantra on my wrist that says, every day's a gift, and I believe that. I'm also a strong believer in what Bobby Kennedy used to say, youth is a state of mind, okay? So you might be a little slower of step, you might slur a little bit, but if you got a young mind, you're still young. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind as that election approaches.
Okay, well, we're going to, it's the CMC's longstanding tradition to take questions, and we're going to do that right now. Jane Scott is with the CMC. She's curating questions from today's live stream audience. And for those of you who are with us in person, please join Jane back there at the microphone. Out of respect to others, please keep your questions brief and to the point so we can get to as many questions as possible. We don't have a hook, we don't have a gong, but if it turns out that you're making a speech, we just might look for one. So be careful and keep in mind that questions do end with a question mark. So that being said, what's our first question?
Actually, Joe, I do have a hook.
Oh, okay. She has a hook.
Yeah, have a hook, my arm. Thank you, Governor, and thank you, Joe. Great conversation. Unfinished business. When you left after 2 terms, was there something on your list that you just really wish you would have gotten to?
Well, I think, one of the regrets I express in the book is I made a decision to commute 8 death penalty cases to life without parole. Actually, one of them was still parole eligible. I think if I had to do it over again, I would have commuted everybody on death row to life without parole. The death penalty is, well, I don't know exactly how uneven it is today, but in 1990, Alex Shoemaker remember this and the rest. I mean, we had 106, I think it was 106 people on death row. The African-American population in the state of Ohio is 12%, 40% of the people on death row were African-American. We have 88 counties in Ohio. Over 20% of the people on death row came from one county, Hamilton County, not Cuyahoga County, not Franklin County, Hamilton County, because that's where they prosecuted and they went for the death penalty. It was terribly uneven. And what we know now with DNA and the rest is that there are more than a handful of people on death row in any state at any time who are almost certainly not guilty of the crime for which they were convicted, even if they made a confession, even if there was an eyewitness. Those things we learn now can be forced or distorted. So that, you know, if you're to pick my biggest regret, I wish I'd ended death row in Ohio.
Margie Pizzuti, it is always a gift and a joy to have you back in Ohio, the heart of it all. So
I'd
thanks
say
for being
stand
here.
up, Margie, but that would be unfair.
Yeah, I am standing.
It's a,
I knew
it's a
you were-
regular joke.
Jane already lowered the mic for me. It was very sweet of her. So I recall the incredible difficulties we had with the collapse of savings and loans in Ohio, and how you were magnificent in navigating our way through that difficult time. Now we are hearing, you know, and a lot of coverage on what's happening at Silicon Valley with the banks. Can you give us a perspective on where we are today and why that happens?
Yeah. Thanks, Margie. You know, it's interesting. C-SPAN, just a couple weeks ago, I did a breakfast talk at the Washington Press Club in 1986, a year after the savings and loan crisis. And C-SPAN pulled that out of the mothballs and reran it. And I hadn't seen myself, you know, in 40 years, 35 years, whatever it was. And that was pretty good. I had hair then. And, you know, here's my takeaway on the Silicon Valley Bank and Home State Savings and Loan, because there is a lesson that is common to both of those. The examiners for the state saving, as a reminder, Home State was a state-regulated savings and loan, privately insured. The state wasn't insuring those 70 institutions, although people thought we were. And so we examined them regularly. And the examiners, 3 years before the failure, 2 years before the failure, and a year before the failure, recognized that Home State had far too many of its assets invested in an outfit down in Florida called ESM. Over 20% of their assets were in ESM. The limit was 5%. We admonished them, but we didn't do, the one thing that we could do would be to issue a cease and desist order. But to do that, we would have to hold a public hearing. And if we held a public hearing, to get a cease and desist order, we would start the very run. That was the danger, right? Silicon Valley Bank, federal examiners, examined Silicon Valley Bank more than a year ago and say, you have a rate risk. You have far too much of your assets invested in these treasury bills, and with the rates going the way they are, that the value of those treasuries is diminishing every single day. You have to address this rate risk. But they had no vehicle. There is no vehicle for the Fed in San Francisco or the Federal Reserve sitting in Washington to force the bank to do that. So, Congresswoman Beatty, if you and your colleagues can help create, I mean, I think this, and I think Sherrod is the one who could provide the leadership on this, frankly. I think that the challenge is to have a tool, which a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer, right? We had a sledgehammer. If we brought the sledgehammer down, we'd knock the bank out, right? If the feds brought a sledgehammer down, they'd knock the bank out. So we need a scalpel designed for this issue.
Nancy Nanny online asks, what is your view on U.S. foreign affairs policy?
Well, that's a big question. I think I'm glad to see the way in which President Biden has re-engaged with the global community. I think our commitment to NATO is essential, and it preserves a degree of stability, particularly when we see Russia assuming its aggressive posture in Europe. I think our effort to engage with friends and potential allies in Pacific is important to manage China. I mean, I think one of the things, we don't need a conflict with China, but it is a very competitive situation, and the Chinese have an expansionist urge in the sense that they'd like to control the South China Sea and limit passage through there. They certainly have been aggressive in building ports and other assets to support our naval force. All of this may be a prelude to an effort to retake Taiwan as part of China, which they believe it is historically. That would be a flashpoint. That would be the one thing that would cause, I think, maybe the only thing that would cause an armed conflict between our two countries, because otherwise the Pacific provides a pretty good cushion between the friction that's going on between us. There will be serious competition in the economic arena, and how we compete is really important. You know, Ohio had, virtue of Jim Rhodes, had the first sister state relationship with any state in China, with the state of Hubei, whose capital is Wuhan, which was in the news because of COVID. I did 2 trade missions to China before Tiananmen Square put a stop to that. But it's tough to compete with the Chinese because the Chinese do steal intellectual property. The Chinese do favor their own over competitors, and so it makes it not easy. So I think having an engaged foreign policy is really important, and one in which we cherish and respect our allies. No one country preserves peace or stability in the world. It is a shared endeavor. So I'm encouraged. The world is changing dramatically. I mean, I spent most of my time in India. I know somebody was going to ask me a question about India. I first went to India in 1963. I left in 1967. I visited several times the Ohio Trade Mission to India. Went back in 1997 as ambassador. Spent another 4 years there, and I've gone back 2 or 3 times every year since. I just was there for a month in January. Just to give you an idea, this country, India, it was 300 million people in 1963 when I went there. Today it's 1.4 billion people. It is more populous than China. The median age in India is 28.7. The median age in China is 38.7. India is younger, more vigorous. It will outcompete the Chinese. In the last 8 years, 73 new airports have been built in India, in one country. 73 new airports, as modern as anything you'll see in the United States. They have built 586,000 kilometers of highway in the last 8 years. They've gone from 13% of their energy transmitted by non-fossil fuels, renewables, to 43% of their energy now being generated by renewable sources, solar, wind, hydro, I mean, and nuclear power. I mean, it's stunning what they are doing. And that's the world in which we are living, competing, have to be part of, have to engage with as we go forward.
A couple questions back to Ohio. Emily Preto asks, are our elections in Ohio even constitutional due to the gerrymandering? And a similar question is, with gerrymandering, do our Ohio legislators even need to listen to voters?
I'm sorry, what was the second one?
With gerrymandering in place, do our legislators even need to listen to voters?
Well, I'm not sure that I understood the second question. But
She's saying with the gerrymandering in place, do Ohio's representatives need to listen to their voters?
well, they need to listen to a few voters, I suppose. I mean, that. No, I think one of the things that happens with gerrymandering is you listen to people who fund your campaigns. and that can be a pretty limited number of folks. I don't think a constitutional challenge to gerrymandering would be effective given the makeup of the Ohio Supreme Court today. I think it really is an issue that has to be taken to the people. I think that we see examples around the country. Certainly, Colorado, where I live currently, has a system for congressional reapportionment and legislative reapportionment that is very fair, and it does create competitive congressional districts. Not competitive enough to get Lauren Boebert out of the crowd, I'm sorry to say, Joyce, but maybe we can do that next time. I think that Ohio needs that issue on the ballot. I hope it's on the ballot next year during the presidential year when people can turn out to vote. And my sense is that an issue that looks a lot like what they did in Michigan the last time around with the real citizens group that doesn't just turn something over to the politicians, but real citizens group drawing the lines with proper guidelines, that issue would pass overwhelmingly.
We have time for one more question here. I'll let you ask it.
I'm John Lowe. As an 80-year-old, I got to tell you, I am very impressed with my 86-year-old friend up there. You're new to me, but it's very impressive. My question is, the Republicans, the right wing generally, have adopted a lot of demonizing terms, and they repeat them over and over. Whether it's woke or Hillary or whatever, and it is influencing people. There's no doubt about it. What do Democrats do? How do you approach that? How do we sort of offset that to some extent?
Well, thanks for the question, John. Look, the opposite of woke is asleep. I mean, stop and think about it. Stop and think about it. All the folks who are making a big deal about this, the opposite of woke is asleep. Is that what you really want? I mean, I know there are a lot of sleepyheads in Florida, but I don't think that's what they really want, right? My feeling is that, and I think, part of it is we should use some humor. We don't want to play necessarily on their field on these things, right? Part of it is telling personal stories. I mean, I watch my children, my grandchildren, and now my great-grandchildren. And I think about the world in which they are growing up and the kinds of things that they are dealing with as young people these days. And they aren't put off by the fact that a lot of advertising now has biracial couples on it. Big deal, right? They see that all the time. With their communities, they see that in their churches, they see it at schools, whatever. They aren't put off by gay kids. They aren't even, I listened to a 13-year-old and a 12-year-old have a conversation in my kitchen 3 years ago. I was making pancakes. They were talking about cisgender and transgender. I didn't know what cisgender was until I asked somebody. I had to talk to my 20-year-old son to say, what is cisgender versus transgender? That way I got educated. Only 30% of the country is really into this. And you have to keep reminding yourself, yes, and we need to listen to and engage with and have conversations over the dinner table with folks who are part of feeling threatened by the changes that are going on in our society. But those changes will go on. If you look at the demographic data, here's one data point that jumped out at me recently. More children were born to single white women than married white women in the last year. And why is that? Because a lot of young people decide getting married isn't that important, right? I have a grandson, Max, and his girlfriend, Rachel. They own a house together. They have 2 kids together. 2 of my grandchildren are, come on. I love them. They're terrific. It is the way the world is going to be. And we should celebrate it. We should embrace it. We should welcome it. We should be energized by it. We should learn from it. It enriches us. It's going to make our culture more interesting. It's going to be the thing that generates the competitiveness that beats the Chinese who are stuck in age-old ways of thinking, that beats anyone who's stuck in age-old ways of thinking. Well, that's how we do it. So I think, just remember, the opposite of woke is asleep. And we have to help. Our job is to help those folks wake up.
Everyone, I wish we had more time because this is great, but I'm getting the wrap-up signal from the back, so I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and he'll have our concluding remarks here.
I hope you enjoyed today's forum. I know for me, hearing the insights of a leader like Governor Celeste is exactly why I love CMC, so thank you for coming with us here today. And I also want to thank Joe for making the conversation so interesting, so thank you. Speaking of gratitude, I want to thank today's sponsors one more time, the Ohio State University and Event Marketing Strategies. Thank you to the Grange Insurance Audubon Center, our virtual seat patrons, Jan Allen, and to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation, the Columbus Dispatch, for supporting today's live stream. And one last time, I want to thank Governor Dick Celeste and Joe Ingles. And he's signaling to me that he will be signing books afterwards. Please make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum, Can Ohio Weather Climate Change, right here at the Grange Insurance Audubon Center. Please also take a moment to answer the short survey that's in your forum flyers. Thank you, everyone. We could not do this without you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.